So the Sea-Dweller is an amazing watch. Matter of fact, it's one of the first modern Rolexes I ever tried on in the wild. I'd highly recommend getting one on the wrist if you know anyone who has one. And if I had the choice of a Rolex dive watch today, it would be the Sea-Dweller. It's a watch that you have to respect. There's great history, background, and rivalry that let this name flourish over the years. Now this video is partly speculative, partly believable. The watch does not exist yet officially, but if there's one thing that we've learned over the years on this channel is that speculation often results in something that materializes, like the Black Bay Pro. So talk has been spreading that there is a new watch in the works, a titanium Sea-Dweller. And the great thing is, instead of just talking about the idea, I can also share some believable concepts of what it could look like and get a bit creative. We can dive into the tech side of what makes these dive watches so cool, discuss a bit of history behind Comex and about the development of these dive watches that belong to Omega and Rolex, and how these two brands just seem to not stop competing with one another. There always seems to be this constant push to outdive the next model. And since we're talking about a Rolex, naturally I'm wearing an Omega, the Seamaster 1957 or the original Seamaster 300. My bond with this watch has just grown stronger and stronger by the day, by the year. There's something about it that just keeps pulling me back. I think it's partly to do with the fact that it's the original. It's based on the CK2913. There are so many quirks and nuances with this design that belongs to Omega. And what I like even more is that this was the starting point. This is what birthed the development of the Aquaterra, the Planet Ocean, the Seamaster Professional that we know today. I think, and I stand corrected, that I am the only channel that has covered these watches to such a great extent. The Deepsea Challenge, the Ultra Deep from Omega, how these two brands are constantly butting heads. So I thought it would be nice to go back into it now with a fresh set of eyes. Just after seeing the new release from Omega, we're now going to see the counter effect from Rolex. It's very funny because at the end of last year I was making a lot of claims that we would be seeing a titanium Yachtmaster, because of course we've been seeing the prototype debuted on the wrist of Sir Ben Ainslie. And in a rare case, Rolex has actually been sharing a lot of information about the technology that's gone into its design, about the RLX titanium that they'll be using and the Nitec woven strap. I still stand by it that I think a titanium Yachtmaster would have been such a great idea. But introducing this watch with a titanium finish would push it into an entirely new area. Instead of it coming across as the dressier dive watch, this could have been a great way for it to step in a new pair of shoes. But then again, thinking about it, titanium belongs with the Sea-Dweller. An extremely brief history of this watch, the Submariner came into play. It moved from being this dressy, formalized sports watch into something more akin to a professional instrument. As these watches were required to travel down to deeper depths, were required for more demanding work, their designs were continually improved, everything from crown guards to deeper bezel knurling to thicker cases, more complex bracelets. The Sea-Dweller was born as a part of a natural progression to improve the technology of the original Submariner, and this all happened in partnership with Comex. Many brands were competing to submit the best designs for these divers to use, makers like Doxa and Omega being two of the best. Of course, we know that the Omega Ploprof was an example that was extremely technologically superior at that time. It used a top-loading design and the case was so hermetically sealed that it passed all of the tests. And there is a lot of great data and documentation showing how the Ploprof was used extensively by Comex divers. But this partnership that Rolex shared with Comex, I think having the two names together sounded good, the relationship flourished. The only issue is that the Submariner's crystals kept popping off. So through development of the 5513 and to the 5514, we started seeing some experimental prototypes of models with helium escape valves. This was in part thanks to a collaboration with Doxa, who helped develop this technology. Essentially a tiny spring-loaded valve that sits in the midcase. And the whole purpose of this system was to clear the watch of small gases as it rose to the surface. We'll talk more about depth, pressure, and gas in a second. But the Sea-Dweller made its name, a model like the 1665, also known as the Double Red Sea-Dweller. You had other examples like the 666, known as the Great White, and the development of the professional watch in this category is pretty amazing. We now had a Rolex dive watch that was built especially for professionals. And this lasted until the end of the 90s, until it was brought back again in the 2000s. In 2008, we saw the introduction of the Deepsea, which was a Sea-Dweller on steroids. There's no other way to put it. Interestingly enough, this watch wasn't very well received at launch. It was too big, too bulky, didn't make much sense for the everyday person. The watch also looked incredibly plain, just a simple black dial, black bezel, overly sized case. But the real game changer was introduced in 2012. James Cameron, Deepsea Challenge, going to the bottom of the Mariana Trench after about 50 years. He pushed the boundaries of modern technology of that time compared to the original depth test in 1960. And to commemorate this event, Rolex decided to launch the James Cameron Deepsea. Blue fading to black on the dial, Deepsea represented in Kawasaki green, believe it or not. James Cameron actually specifically wanted Kawasaki green on his submersible as a color. A brilliant choice, I will add, if you know your motorbikes. And over the years, this James Cameron Deepsea has been a huge success. People want to own the watch for bragging rights, considering the fact that this is the most technologically superior dive watch that Rolex has ever made. It's quite a nice statement to have on the wrist. As of this year, 2022, they've actually updated this watch in a few small places, like adjusting the bracelets, adjusting the size of the case. That, in a nutshell, is the very brief history of the Sea-Dweller. But before we get into talking about the design of this next watch, where things could change, where the inspirations could come from, also discussing the future of titanium, I first want to talk really briefly about depth ratings with dive watches, air pressure, and redundancy. Because you hear about these numbers being thrown around so often that enthusiasts can't go into a bath or a shower unless the watch is 300 meters waterproof. I think it would be a great time, since we're talking about the deepest dive watches, to quickly cover a few myths around depth rating. Now, contrary to popular belief, the pressure of the water on the human body is not the real issue, especially at those depths. When we start traveling down to 1,000 meters, then it gets worse. But 100 meters, 150 meters, the human body doesn't react to the actual weight of the water. The issue is the pressure that the water has on the gases that you are breathing. And this factors in very nicely with the context around the helium escape valve. Nitrogen gas compresses so much. Now, most people believe that when they jump into the water, they can strap on a tank and swim down to 100 meters and be perfectly fine. The common belief today is that you're breathing oxygen, and only oxygen. You're actually breathing air, which is the majority of nitrogen with a small portion of oxygen. As you go deeper down, these gases get smaller and smaller to a point where oxygen becomes really difficult to breathe. By the time you reach 100 meters, you're sucking on that regulator so hard to get the air in because the pressure is building up so much around it, which means that you have to mix gases. You have to add helium into the equation. There are also all kinds of other things. When you travel down to a depth of 100 meters, nitrogen narcosis kicks in, so you're struggling. Then you hear about words like saturation diving, a completely different field, meaning you're fully saturated with nitrogen. And these are the guys that live in diving bells and live in pressurized containers on ships. All I can say, very briefly in a nutshell, is that people don't know what they're talking about. 300 meter depth rating in a watch is ridiculous. Traveling down 100 meters in the water, you have to be really skilled and you have to know what you're doing. It should also be stated that when watches are pressure tested, the numbers you see on the dial generally sit in the ballpark of being a minimum or at least 2/3 of the entire depth that the watch could travel. So when it says that your watch is rated for 300 meters, it's actually rated for probably 400 meters plus. 300 meters is like the safety stop where they know this watch is ample and it won't be affected by the pressure underneath. After this long-winded discussion, why am I saying all of this? Well, when you look to the Sea-Dweller and the Deepsea, these watches are so overbuilt, it's just beyond unnecessary. It just pushes your imagination so far out of reality. The reason why these watches are made so big is that by the time you reach 3,000 or 4,000 meters down, the pressure of the water really does crush things. 100 meters and 300 meters, not so much. Strongly built watches like these is an understatement. Let's go on to talking about titanium and what I believe is going to be one of the future metals. The future is titanium. Well, first off, the material is abundant. We look at brands like Grand Seiko, we look at Omega, we look at Tudor. All of these makers are experimenting with the material. Grade 2, grade 5. What does it offer that steel doesn't? The world of luxury watches are expected to have weight, are expected to be heavy, but we're seeing a lot of changes nowadays in many respects. High-performance professional watches are now using materials like forged carbon, combining it with advanced polymers and elastomers, ceramics, sapphires. When we talk about the professional watch, a lot of people crave lightness, durability. And another thing to factor in today is that with stainless steel, a watch that's brushed or polished, it gives off a certain luster. And nowadays, a lot of people are preferring the subtlety of a watch. A prime example of a brand that's breaking ground with titanium is Grand Seiko. The way they finish their cases, their bracelets. On the outside, it looks like any other metal, but only those who know it's titanium, which allows it to have so many other great properties. Not only lightness and strength, but importantly, corrosion resistance. You see, titanium actually forms an oxidation layer, which protects it against moisture and all sorts of other chemicals that may affect it, which makes it perfect for the atmosphere and the sea. Maybe not now, at this moment, but I strongly believe that the future is titanium. And I just think it's a material that is way more advanced, especially for applications like what we're talking about right now. Okay, to the design and to the rumored specifications of this watch. Not much is known about it, it's been shared on a couple of forums, but so far we know that it's supposedly going to be an anniversary watch, that it's going to be in full titanium, and is going to have a water resistance rating of 39,000 feet, which is the exact same specs of the Challenger Deep prototype. This is something that I'm going to question. There is also mention that the watch is going to have an engraving on the case back marking 1960 and the date of the first Trieste launch down to the Mariana Trench. Okay, getting beyond that, I do believe this is going to be an anniversary watch, but it's not going to be one that marks the Trieste descent, but it's going to mark the Deepsea Challenge. As of now, 2022, it's been 10 years since James Cameron took the Deepsea Challenge down to the bottom of the trench. So to mark this occasion, they bring out a tribute watch of sorts in full titanium. This is very believable. But as far as the depth rating goes, this is where I start scratching my head, because we've just seen the launch of the Omega Ultra Deep. This watch is now commercially available, and it's rated at 20,000 feet or 6,000 meters. Now that is insane as it is. Bearing in mind also that the original prototypes that were used, as well as this new model, has been launched in titanium. So to consider that Rolex plans on bringing out a watch that is rated at the same depth as the original Deepsea Challenger, which was 12,000 meters or 39,000 feet, which is quite literally double the depth of the Omega Ultra Deep. I mean, judging by how these brands compete against one another, it's not in the realms of impossibility, but this watch would be huge. And something tells me that Rolex wouldn't bring out a watch of this size and make it commercial. That's the only thing in this equation that makes me scratch my head. Granted also that since the initial launch of the Deepsea until now, there has been great improvements in the areas of gasket technology, of threading for screw-down crowns. It's really interesting though, all things considered. So my belief is that this watch is going to be in 44mm. It's going to be a Deepsea Sea-Dweller, and it's going to be using what Rolex calls the RLX Titanium. The question then is, what color are they going to introduce it with? Are there going to be any accent colors, any spot colors? And I thought about this a lot. Something about titanium as a metal is it has a matte finish. And what we have seen from the Sea-Dweller up until now is that it predominantly uses a gloss dial with a gloss bezel. So I am predicting that this titanium model may be launched with a matte dial and a matte ceramic bezel. You know, so simply done. There doesn't need to be a color on the dial at all. Black on black looks great. And the one accent color on this watch that would work extremely well for a specific reason. We have seen the Sea-Dweller using red text. We've seen the Deepsea using green. This model in titanium can use orange. Why do I say that? Well, if we look at the original 1960 Trieste submersible, the hatch at the top had an orange accent. Now that in one way is a brilliant way of hinting to the history of the submersible, of commemorating an anniversary without overplaying it. So I'm thinking to keep it subtle and subdued, an entire matte finish with a simple color accent. And I think this watch would look great. Of course, it's going to be the most expensive titanium watch ever sold. Once it hits the grey market, it'll be virtually unobtainable. It'll definitely fall into the category of being a collectible model because it is celebrating an anniversary. It's the first titanium watch that Rolex has ever made. The only time Rolex has ever used titanium in the past is for the caseback of the Deepsea. I guess very basically you could say there's a lot of opportunity and great potential for this watch to commemorate a special anniversary, introduce a new metal into the family, but also to bring out the most technologically superior dive watch that the brand has ever produced. And if these rumors are correct, which I believe is highly likely, we'll be seeing a watch like this launched in September 2022. Commemorating the original Deepsea, but also giving us a Sea-Dweller that's more compliant with modern spec, and a Sea-Dweller with new technology that leads the group of professional Rolex models.